Onto your headphones and pour your favorite beverage. It's time for the Kickin or Stickin Fantasy Football Podcast. Now, fresh off the sidelines, your host, Matt McPeak.
Fantasy freaks and geeks, what is up? Welcome to the Week 5 episode of the Kickin or Stickin Fantasy Football Podcast. Thanks for joining me tonight. I am Matt McPeak. It is Thursday night at about 8 o'clock, so I'm going to pretty much force myself to do this episode in less than a half hour, because last week I was at like 45 minutes, and I really want to keep it to a half hour for you guys, so let's jump into it. First game is the Cardinals at the Jets. DeAndre Hopkins played last week despite being questionable all week, and he still led his team in targets. He's obviously a must-start. Christian Kirk finally gave us an okay game with that touchdown that he had, but he's still done very little this year. Less than 20 fantasy points on the season so far, and that's in full PPR. Only 4 to 5 targets a game, so he's been a big disappointment so far against this horrible secondary of the Jets. I'd love to be able to start Christian Kirk. I have him in too many leagues, but I just can't put him in my starting lineup and feel good about it. Kenyan Drake was another big disappointment last week. I had him as one of my touchdown scorers for the prop bets. He did get hurt in the game, but he had 13 touches before that, and he only had 2.6 yards per carry. So it was a really good matchup for him, as good of a matchup as you can get for a running back, and he didn't produce. So that was very disappointing. If he does play in Week 5, I got to imagine he's not going to get as much work as we'd want him to. Plus, Chase Edmonds played really well, caught 5 of his 6 targets, and scored. If you have Drake, and I do in 3 leagues, I would make it a priority this week to get Edmonds. Do whatever you got to do in a trade. You're going to want one of these 2 guys going forward. Seems like in 2020 is the year the handcuff gods are barking at us. Only 3 teams have allowed more touchdowns to running backs so far this year than the Jets. So if Drake doesn't play, I would love to have Edmonds. I'm probably going to put him in every single DFS lineup that I make. For the Jets, the only guy you can really start is Jamison Crowder, and that's if Sam Darnold plays, which I'm pretty sure he is not going to play. I'm pretty sure it's Joe Flacco. He's had 7 catches and 100 yards. 7 catches and 100 yards in each of the 2 games that he's played in so far this year. So definitely want to play Jamison Crowder. I think Le'Veon Bell is returning, but I'm not starting him this week. I think the Jets are going to have a pretty rough time at it. Panthers at Falcons. Teddy Bridgewater coming off of one of his best games of his career, really. 276 passing yards, 2 touchdowns. He also had 32 yards rushing and a rushing touchdown against the Falcons defense, and with Rodgers and Stafford on bye. I think maybe Bridgewater is a pretty decent waiver wire fill-in if you're somebody that doesn't really carry a backup quarterback. Mike Davis continues to be great, filling in for Christian McCaffrey, over 100 total yards and a touchdown with 5 catches. Robbie Anderson led the team he led the wide receivers in targets for the 2nd straight game. He has become a pretty nice flex play and maybe even a number 2 wide receiver in PPR leagues. DJ Moore is still a start despite losing a lot of targets to Robbie Anderson. He's probably now a number 2 wide receiver as well, and not the number 1 that we all drafted him for. And then for the Falcons, pretty much you have to start Todd Gurley. You got to start any running back facing this Panthers run defense. They're horrible. Gurley did score twice last week, so that's pretty good. And then you got these wide receivers. Julio's a start every week no matter what. And then you got Calvin Ridley, who absolutely killed me last week. Oh, my God. I had him going in 5 different leagues last week, and I lost in 4 of those 5 leagues because he put up a dud. Next is the Bengals at the Ravens. This should be a fun game. The Bengals are in the top 10 in fantasy points allowed to running backs, so start your Ravens running backs. The Bengals have allowed the most rushing yards to quarterbacks last year, and they've already given up 65 yards and a touchdown to Carson Wentz. Carson Wentz in week 3. So Lamar should have a field day against the Bengals this week. The Bengals are one of 7 teams that have not allowed a tight end to score in 2020. I think Mark Andrews takes them out of that club this week. Of those 7 teams that have not allowed a tight end touchdown yet, Cincinnati has allowed the most receiving yards to that position. Plus, last year in the 2 games against the Bengals, Mark Andrews had 99 yards in the first game and then 53 yards with 2 touchdowns in the second game. So he likes to play Cincinnati. Joe Mixon had a huge game last week against Jacksonville, 42 fantasy points, but the Ravens have one of the best running defenses, rush defenses in the league. So if you are going to start him, I would expect his numbers to look more like they did in the first 3 weeks, which was around 8 fantasy points. So, be prepared if the guy goes from 41 points to one week to less than 10 the next week. Unfortunately for the A.J. Green owners out there, it seems like Tyler Boyd and the rookie T. Higgins are really the only playable Bengals wide receivers. After leading the team in targets in weeks 1 and 2, A.J. Green has seen less targets than the rookie, and in both of the last 2 games, Boyd as well. So Boyd's led the team in targets in both of those games. So I'm sitting A.J. Green, and I'd consider adding T. Higgins in case this really is the end of the road for A.J. Green. If Higgins is still out there in your waiver wire and you're an A.J. Green owner, I would make that switch. Jaguars at Texans. Maybe the firing of Bill O'Brien sparks something for the Texans, but I doubt it because it's the Houston defense that's been incredibly bad. David Johnson had a decent performance last week, got the touches you want to see, but he's still nothing more than a flex. They've given up, on average, over 30 points per game. Just not too great. So Will Fuller caught a 24-yard touchdown, had over 100 yards. When he's healthy, you play him. The interesting possible plays to me are the Texans' tight ends, Jordan Akins and Darren Fells. They've each scored, but Akins has a few more targets. The Jaguars have I think they're second or third in receiving yards allowed to tight ends. So, but we got to see how this offense is going to look with Bill O'Brien gone before we can comfortably start anyone but Fuller and Deshaun Watson, in my opinion. My favorite player in this game, though, is the undrafted rookie James Robinson. 3 of 4 games with 100-plus total yards, averaging just under 5 yards per carry. The Texans have been atrocious against the run this year. They've allowed, on average, 181 yards a game. So start James Robinson. DJ Shark returned last week, and he saw more targets than he had seen in weeks 1 and 2 combined. Plus, he scored twice against the Bengals. In this first game against the Texans last year, he had 18.5 full PPR fantasy points. So I think as long as he gets the number 1 targets, he's definitely a good start against the Texans. Next is the Raiders and the Chiefs. Obviously, you start Clyde and Hill and Kelsey and Mahomes. The tough decision for the Chiefs is Mecole Hardman. He now has a touchdown in 3 straight games. And last year, he had a touchdown in the first Chiefs-Raiders game as well. So maybe that's a guy you take a stab at. For the Raiders, it's Josh Jacobs and Darren Waller, and that's pretty much it. The Chiefs have surprisingly allowed the 3rd fewest receptions and the fewest receiving yards on the season to tight ends, which has them allowing the fewest fantasy points to wide receivers as well. So I'm not starting Hunter Renfrow after the game against the Bills. He was a big letdown. The Bills' one weakness is defending slot receivers, yet Renfrow only had 5 catches, 2 of them coming very late in the fourth quarter during the garbage time. So I'm not starting either of the rookies for Vegas, even if they do play. Next is the Rams at the Washington football team. The Rams only had 58 yards rushing in Week 4 after racking up over 150 rushing yards in each of the first 3 games. Super disappointing game for Darrell Henderson coming off his 100-yard game in Week 3. In Week 4, Henderson only got 8 carries and 1 target. I actually started him over Joe Mixon as a flex play in a league last year, so that was a fantastic call by me. Cost me about 35 points. I am really hoping Henderson can get back on track here against the Washington football team, who is in the middle of the pack as far as fantasy points allowed to running backs. Last week, if Cam Akers is active, here's a potential spam call. Here, let's let him listen in on the podcast here. So where were we? I think I'm sitting Henderson. I'm only playing Henderson if I know for a fact that Akers is out. We saw last week how splitting carries with just Malcolm Brown is bad enough. If Akers is healthy too, it makes pretty much all 3 of these guys unstartable. We're starting Cooper Kupp, Robert Woods, and I think Tyler Higbee is deserving of a start as well. Washington, one of only 4 teams that have allowed 5 or more touchdowns to tight ends. Higbee had that huge 3-touchdown game against Philly. I think he got, and he hasn't scored since, so I think he's got a pretty good chance to score here. I think the only Washington players you can really play are Terry McLaurin and Antonio Gibson. I was on the fence about Gibson last week because he only had 7 targets through the first 3 games, but last week against the Ravens, he saw 5 targets, caught 4 of them for 82 yards, and he gave us a solid 46 yards rushing and a touchdown on 13 carries. So he was still out-targeted by J.D. McKissic, though, for the 3rd time this year. The Rams have allowed on average 100 yards rushing and 50 yards receiving per game to running backs so far. So if Gibson can get half of that, catch 4 balls, he could get to double-digit fantasy points, and then you're pretty much just hoping for a touchdown. So, but I'm playing Antonio Gibson if I have him, which I don't in any of my leagues, which kind of sucks. Colts at Browns. With Nick Chubb going down last week, Kareem Hunt is now a must-start running back every week. Hopefully he'll see a good 20 touches a game until Chubb returns. But this Colts run defense has been pretty damn good. 3rd fewest fantasy points to running backs. So I'm not going to freak out after this game if Hunt only ends up with like 8 to 10 points. If Chubb is going to be out for multiple weeks, Hunt is going to be awesome. OBJ and Landry are probably still starts for most people, but this is not the easiest matchup. The Colts give up the fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks, so it might be a run-heavy game for the Browns. As a Jonathan Taylor manager, I really wish Nyheim Hines and Jordan Wilkins weren't getting 9 carries each, but any running backs getting 15-plus touches a week with that offensive line is a start in fantasy football. The Browns have given up 4 touchdowns to tight ends this season, and Mo Alley Cox has a touchdown in back-to-back games now. Can he make it 3? We will find out. Giants at Cowboys. You start all 3 Cowboy wide receivers, but I don't know if Dalton Schultz is a play here. He had his first big game last week with a touchdown and 72 yards, but the Giants have actually been pretty good against tight ends so far. They haven't allowed a tight end to score. Obviously, Zach and Deke are must-starts. Zeke and Dak, not Dak and Zeke. Zeke and Dak. And honestly, I think that's pretty much it for this game. I guess you can start Evan Ingram if you really have no other options, but the Cowboys have allowed the 4th most receptions to tight ends. So here's Evan Ingram again, looking like he's in a good position. Let's see if he can actually take advantage of it. Vikings at Seahawks. Justin Jefferson had a 2nd really good game in a row, and in this game, the Vikings are going to need him because the Seahawks are going to put up points. I think Jefferson has put himself into flex range. Hopefully, Kirk Cousins can continue to support both Thielen and Jefferson. The Seahawks' big 4 are, obviously Chris Carson, Russell Wilson, Tyler Lockett, and DK Metcalf. You start them every week. The next game is the Bills and the Titans, which I just saw before I started recording that this game has been moved to Tuesday. But I'll still give the preview. Just, I wrote it yesterday. If things changed, don't get pissed at me. The Titans are coming off that impromptu bye week after multiple players tested positive. The Bills are coming off a nice win over the Raiders. For the Bills, it's Josh Allen. He's become a must-start. Stephon Diggs, obviously. Devin Singletary has also been great this year so far. He's scored more fantasy points each game with only 8 points in the first week and then 16 points last week. So that number has gradually gone up every week. For Singletary's sake, hopefully Moss misses this game again because the Titans have allowed the 10th most fantasy points to running backs this year, and with them literally not practicing in like 10 days or something, I think this is the week that maybe Devin Singletary really goes off. For the Titans, I think Derrick Henry and A.J. Brown are really the only starts, and I don't want to waste any more time on this game. So, Eagles at Steelers. Philly got their first win of the season last week, vaulting them atop the NFC East. The Eagles got lucky with a pick six because without it, I think they would have lost that game. Honestly, I don't know how you can start any Eagles in this game besides Miles Sanders. But even for him, this is a tough matchup. The Steelers have allowed the second fewest fantasy points to running backs. If the Steelers' defense has a weakness, they have gotten beat up by a few wide receivers, mainly Darius Slay. But can you really – Darius Slayton. But can you really start Greg Ward? He did have a touchdown and 72 yards in Week 3 in that tie against the Bengals. But he had less than 40 yards in the other 3 games. And in one of those 3 games, he had 1 catch for 5 yards. So I can't play him. I wish I could say keep playing Zach Ertz, but last week, only 4 catches for just 9 yards, only 5 targets. He was getting so much attention by the 49ers. The Steelers are above average against tight ends, and with the Eagles possessing really no threat anywhere else on the field besides Sanders, I think the Steelers will be able to lock Ertz down the same way that the 49ers did. Really, I hate to say it because Ertz has been one of my favorite players over the past few years. Dude would catch 10 passes a game or whatever, easy. But it's just that's not him anymore. The Eagles secondary has been pretty bad this year. They've allowed the 7th most receptions to wide receivers. Coming off a bye, I'm going to play Juju and Deontay Johnson, James Conner, and I even think Eric Ebron is worth a start if you're hurting at tight end, maybe a streaming tight end. You can take a shot with. The Eagles have allowed the 5th most receptions and receiving yards to tight ends, and they've allowed 5 touchdowns to tight ends already as well. Next is the Dolphins and the 49ers. The Dolphins really let me down last week. I had the Seahawks-Dolphins game as my over in Week 4, and I missed it by 1 frickin' point. The Dolphins kicked 5 field goals. The only touchdown they scored was a Fitzpatrick rushing touchdown. Devontae Parker still had a good game, though. 10 catches for 110 yards. Mike Gesicki, however, did not. Second consecutive game with only 1 catch on 3 targets for 15 yards. Aside from his huge Week 2 game when he had 23 half PPR fantasy points, Gesicki has done virtually nothing. 5 catches for just 50 yards and a touchdown. We just saw what the 49ers did to Zach Ertz, so I am not playing Mike Gesicki this week, which is a huge kick in the ass for me. I just traded a second-round pick in next year's rookie draft in one of my dynasty leagues for Mike Gesicki last week. Hopefully he can get a little bit more involved in the offense like I thought he was going to going into this season. Myles Gaskins was also kind of a letdown last week with only 3 catches. I thought he would be more involved in a high-scoring game, but it just didn't work out like that. Despite the 49ers trading away DeForest Buckner this offseason and then losing Nick Bosa and Solomon Thomas, they are still allowing the fewest fantasy points to running backs, so I'm not playing Gaskins. 2 more games here. We got the Broncos at the Patriots. This game is hard to break down because we just don't know what's going to happen at quarterback with Cam getting COVID. Does Brian Hoyer get the start again, or does Jarrett Stidham start after coming into the game last week? Because of all that, I think the safest play, and I can't believe I'm saying this, I think the safest play is running back Damien Harris from at least for the Patriots, the safest Patriot play. He had 17 carries for 100 yards right on the button. Sony Michel is on the IR now, and they're not giving Rex Burkhead 15 carries. So I'm starting Harris in a non-PPR league that I have Nick Chubb on the IR, and Leonard Fournette is he was doubtful, but I actually saw like 5 minutes before I started recording that he's now active for this game, so that's great. The Broncos' run D has been average against the run with so many injuries on their D-line. I don't think that I'm starting a Patriots running back not named James White, but it's my best option right now, so I got to go with him. Although now that I know Fournette is active, maybe I need to start Fournette. I don't know what the hell to do here. James White saw 8 targets in his first game back. He's a start in full PPR, obviously, and I think that's it in this game. I'm not starting any of those Patriot wide receivers without Cam at quarterback. Last game here, the Drew Brees Bowl, Chargers at Saints. Not sure as of right now whether Michael Thomas will play for sure. Seems like Austin Eckler will miss this game and probably a few games after with that hamstring injury. I missed on Alvin Kamara's receptions prop last week. Took the over 6.5 after he caught 13 balls on 14 targets in week 4. But I think he only ended up seeing like 4 or 5 targets last week, so that sucks. The Chargers have yet to allow a rushing touchdown to a running back, but they have given up 2 receiving touchdowns and the 6th most receptions to running backs. So I think Kamara will see enough a big target share if Michael Thomas misses again, and even if he does play, I think Kamara will see plenty of targets. Traquan Smith caught 2 touchdowns last week on only 4 targets. The Chargers have been, on average, they're a pretty average defense against wide receivers so far. So he's not a terrible start, but that's really only if Michael Thomas is out. I can't start Traquan Smith if Michael Thomas does play. Both teams are in the top 10 in fantasy points allowed to tight ends. So Jared Cook is still questionable, but seems like he's in line to play. So maybe he's in line for a nice game. And Hunter Henry has a really good chance to get his first touchdown of the year. I'm starting Hunter Henry in, I think, 3 different leagues. I drafted him a lot this year. And I know there's a lot of people out there that are still going to start Josh Kelly this week, but I'm not going to recommend it. He hasn't shown me enough, and I think the Saints' defense is pretty good. So I get it, with all the injuries you might have to, but I'm not doing it. So that's going to do it. I'm going to take a hot minute, and I'm going to jump into our Week 5 podcast picks. All right. Here we go with our Week 5 podcast picks. Went 5-4 last week. Took Kenyan Drake instead of Dalvin Cook like an idiot as one of my TD scores. I missed on both my over and under. Miami cost me that over with the 5 field goals. So not the greatest week last week, but I'll take it. I'm still 24-12. That's a 66% hit rate, I think. Yeah, 2/3. But anyway, I hit on my road dog of the week for the 4th week in a row. So let's get into the Week 5 picks here. My picks against the spread. I'm going to take the Chiefs minus 12.5 versus the Raiders. The Chiefs won both of their games against the Raiders last year by a combined score of 68-19. They won by 14, 3, 14, and 16 points so far this year. They outscored their opponents by 143 points last year. I think the Raiders are going to be down both of their rookie wide receivers, and the Chiefs are actually allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points to tight ends. So they should be able to hold the Raiders' best player, Darren Waller, in check. Give me the Chiefs to win by 2 touchdowns. Next is the Rams, minus 7.5 at the Washington football team. Kyle Allen is making his first start in Washington this week. Ron Rivera and the coaching staff must have just gotten sick of watching Dwayne Haskins. Kyle Allen wasn't the worst quarterback in the league last year, but I don't see him coming in and making this offense look any better than it did with Haskins under center. The Rams have an above-average defense. In their last 3 wins, they've outscored their opponents by 29 points. Their only loss was against the Bills in Week 3, and it took a horrible penalty and a last-minute field goal to beat them. Last week, the Rams got away from the run. I think they get back to it this week. I think they try and neutralize that Washington pass rush. Washington has given up the 8th most fantasy points to quarterbacks and the 4th most to tight ends through the first 4 weeks of the season. I think the Rams get Tyler Higbee and Gerald Everett going in this game. Maybe they look at that Eagles film from week 1 and how they utilize the 2 tight ends, which is something the Rams very rarely do. But after that very poor offensive performance last week, I think they might come out and just run the hell out of the ball and take their shots off play action. So if I'm parlaying this, I would buy it down to 6.5, so you only need to win by 1 score. But straight up, I think the Rams win by a good 10 points in this game. So give me the Rams minus 7.5. And the last pick against the spread is the Colts -1.5 against the Browns. I think the Colts defense has really started to show their true colors. I took the Colts D in a bunch of fantasy leagues with my last pick because I think they're one of the better defenses in the league. And with a running game like the one they have in Indy, that just helps the defense so much. Keeps the defense fresh, keeps games tight, and allows them to be aggressive. The Colts have only allowed 29 points in the last 3 games last week after Nick Chubb went down. The Browns offense kind of stalled. They really, if they didn't get those 2 touchdowns on gimmick plays by OBJ, I think the Browns would have blown that huge lead against the Cowboys. The Browns' run D has been pretty good so far this year, but their pass defense has been pretty awful. I think the Colts use a game plan very similar to what we will see from the Rams, and just run the ball and use play action to take some shots with T.Y. Hilton and Mo Alley Cox. The Browns have allowed 6 receptions per game to running backs, so maybe we see Naheem Hines as well catch a handful of balls and make some plays. My over for Week 5 is going to be the Chargers at the Saints, over 50.5 points. Usually I don't like taking overs in games where the best player on a team is most likely going to be out, but we don't know if Michael Thomas is going to miss this game for sure or not, and we probably won't know until Monday night, maybe Sunday we find out, but I doubt it. And then you got, for the Chargers, Austin Eckler is going to be out for a few weeks with a pretty serious hamstring injury. I think this is going to force the Chargers to throw the ball more than they usually do. I really like this kid, Justin Herbert, man. He's been looking awesome. He's averaging over 300 passing yards per game through his first 3 games. He hit on a handful of deep balls really last week against the Bucs, and the Saints D has not been what it was last year. Only 2 teams have allowed more passing touchdowns this year than the Saints, and they've also been getting beat up by tight ends. 5 touchdowns allowed, 2 tight ends this year. I think the Chargers can contribute a good 21 to 24 points here, and the Saints have showed us over the past 3 games that even without Michael Thomas, they can score. So they've been averaging 30 points a game in those 3 games without Michael Thomas. So if he plays, I think they can put up 30 points easy, and even if he doesn't play, I think they can get to 27, 28 points. So I like the Chargers at the Saints as my over, 50.5 total points. My under for the week. We did our over, now we got the under. Colts at Browns, 46.5 is the over-under right now. I think both coaches here have no problem with an ugly, low-scoring, run-the-ball and play defense type of game. The Colts defense, as I mentioned a minute ago, has been pretty damn good this year. I don't see the Browns putting up a 40-burger on the Colts. And although the Browns definitely, the defense was exposed last week, I don't think the Colts have an offense, an explosion like we saw from the Cowboys. Not every team has the amount of firepower that the Cowboys have with that trio of wide receivers and a top 5 running back and a dual threat quarterback. So I think this game ends up being one of those 20-17 games, maybe 24-21 at the most. As long as we don't get any defensive or special team scores, I think this game stays under pretty easily. My Week 5 touchdown scores. So anytime touchdown scores, I got 3 running backs this week. Mike Davis, the Falcons have gotten beat up by running backs catching the ball. 2nd most receptions and 3rd most receiving yards allowed to running backs so far this year. Mike Davis has 23 targets through 3 games. And the best part is he's caught all but 2 of them. So I think Davis gets his hands on a bunch of passes, and hopefully he scores on one of them. If you don't like the whole touchdown score bet, then just take his over in receptions prop, because as long as they don't set it at like 7.5, then if it's anything over 5.5, 6.5, I would take it. But I wouldn't feel comfortable going with over on a 7.5. I'm not sure if he can catch 8, but 6 or 7 definitely. James Robinson. The Texans have allowed over 160 rushing yards per game every game so far this year. There was the one game in Week 2 where they allowed over 200 rushing yards. Dalvin Cook, Alexander Madison, James Conner, Mark Ingram, and Clyde Edwards-Helaire have all scored against the Texans, so I love James Robinson this week. And then my third touchdown scorer is Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Hasn't scored since week 1, so I think he's due, which may seem like a ridiculous thing to say in football, but in that Chiefs offense, if you're getting 20 touches a game, you're going to score some touchdowns. So I think Clyde gets it done. The Raiders have allowed the most rushing touchdowns so far and the most fantasy points to running backs. So whether it's in the air or on the ground, I think Clyde gets into the end zone. And let's move on over to our road dog of the week for week 5.
Oh, you didn't know? Your ass better call somebody!
Go with the road dog of the week for week 5. I'm taking the Carolina Panthers plus 1.5 at the Atlanta Falcons. I was going to take the Jaguars getting 5 points, but the Jacksonville defense might be without a bunch of guys on their defense, and I think the Houston defense plays with their hair on fire for Romeo Crennel this week. But the Falcons defense has been horrible this year, and the Falcons wide receivers have been super banged up. The Panthers put up 30 points last week for the second time this year. I think the Panthers can go in and take this game. It opened at plus 3.5 for the Panthers, but it has moved down 2 points in whatever it has been 4 days, 3 or 4 days, because obviously there's a lot of people out there that feel the same way as me. So I like the Panthers as the road dog of the week for week 5, and that's going to do it for the week 5 episode of the Kickin' or Stickin' Fantasy Football Podcast. Ooh, excuse me. Had some chili for lunch today. The chef at work made some dope chili, and it was delicious. So that's going to do it. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure you check us out next week. And as always, may the fantasy gods be cruel to your opponents.
You have been listening to the Kickin' or Stickin' Fantasy Football Podcast. For more great episodes and information, follow us on social media and tune in every week. Kickin' or Stickin' is available on Google Podcasts, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Alexa, Reach.tv, or your favorite podcast service. Kickin' or Stickin' is a proud member of the HC Universal Network family of podcasts. To find out more about this and other great shows on our network, visit us online at hcuniversalnetwork.com today. Fantasy football is fun, but gambling addiction destroys lives. If you or someone you love suffers from gambling addiction, please do not be afraid to seek help. The National Council on Problem Gambling operates the National Problem Gambling Helpline Network. Contact them today at 1-800-522-4700. Thank you for tuning in to the Kickin' or Stickin' Fantasy Football Podcast. Please remember to play responsibly and always look for your man downfield.